here. Tomorrow morning, my goal is to finish the morning calendar by 9:30. I'm not going to do the hour-and-a-half departure, although I would appreciate a lunch break right around noon for an hour, and that's it. Monday, I've got to cover my own pre-trials. I only have 34. I think I can get them done by 11 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay? So
we might be able to start at 9:30, you said, tomorrow.
Okay, are we ready?
Yes.
Refill?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah.
I do have to stop at noon today. I'll be back at 1. Council approach, please.
Dr. Mayer, just before the break, we were talking about ideas of reference. What impact can having an idea of reference have on a person?
So an idea of reference is this false idea that a person is referring to something in their environment and believing it's something very different than what it really is in terms of its meaning to them. Ideas of reference often tend to have a disproportionately powerful influence on the person's thinking process. So the idea that it has special meaning, special significance, which is especially important to them as an individual and is especially powerful, is a part of that process. In this case, this Swedish Bible that John had and the sounds that were coming from it would represent an idea of reference.
When a person is experiencing psychosis, does an outsider, does somebody else necessarily see it or know it?
Typically not. Typically, especially when a person is experiencing the baseline level of psychosis, just because a person's psychotic doesn't mean they're completely unaware of their environment. They are aware of their environment. They maintain the normal pattern of not wanting to be embarrassed, not wanting to be seen negatively by the people around them. So a person who is psychotic might believe that they know what's really going on, but they also understand that other people are going to think that they're confused and they don't know what's going on. So they don't wear their psychosis on their sleeve, if you will. They don't make it apparent. So a person who's psychotic can certainly go into a restaurant and order a meal. A person who's psychotic can talk to a stranger on the street. You might think they're a little odd, but you wouldn't think they're psychotic. We can't see psychosis directly unless the person is what sometimes is described as floridly psychosis, and that essentially refers to obviously psychosis, obviously psychotic. So if a person is standing on the street corner ranting and raving at voices in their head that nobody else can see, it might be obvious, even to a non-professional, that they're out of touch with reality.
Okay. And you mentioned, it sort of relates back, when you were speaking about hallucinations, you said something to the effect of, the person may or may not disclose that they're having hallucinations. Is that sort of playing into what we're talking about here, whether there's an outward manifestation of the psychosis?
Yes. People who are mentally ill, people who have brain illness, people who are psychotic, typically retain an understanding and a sensitivity to how they would be seen by their social environment, how they would be seen by the people around them. And they don't want to be seen negatively. Even people who are very psychotic maintain this desire not to be identified as weird or strange or bad or peculiar or out of touch. So very often, whether it's a clinical situation or a forensic legal situation, individuals who are psychotic don't want to reveal it. They want to keep it to themselves.
Is there an impact, or can a person's sleep pattern be, is it relevant to a psychotic episode and what a person is experiencing?
Yes. So among the characteristics, and I didn't particularly mention this, but among the characteristics of emotional distress, fear, anxiety, those characteristics are especially associated with irritability, agitation, and those things interfere with sleep. So a person who is experiencing particularly those symptoms of a psychotic episode is likely to have difficulty sleeping, is likely to have difficulty sleeping restfully, sleeping well, feeling rested, and tragically, unfortunately, the lack of sleep makes the psychosis worse, the psychosis makes the lack of sleep worse, and those people can sometimes get into a repeating cycle that makes things much, much worse as days go on.
Okay. So we've talked about psychosis generally, we've talked about these different aspects of it. In general, how does this description of psychosis that you've just given to the jury, how does that apply to Mr. Jonchuck? We'll get to the more specifics in a moment, but generally speaking.
His condition is one of chronic psychosis. It's very difficult to say when exactly in his life that began, but certainly years before he was arrested, before these tragic events occurred. There's very good evidence in his treatment with Dr. Arthur, for example, that he was suffering from a severe mental health condition that included psychosis. The psychosis, therefore, is chronic. It's been there for a long time. My best understanding and reading of the record and all the information is that it's very hard to identify periods in his life in the last 5 years when he wasn't at least a little bit disturbed. And that suggests that he was probably always had some symptoms of psychosis. There are times where they seem to have been less relevant to his day-to-day functioning, and he seems to have functioned reasonably well. However, there have also been repeated episodes of severe psychosis. So as we apply this to him, there's this baseline level, and there are these severe episodes on top of it.
Is there any sort of analogy that you could give to the jury to help understand what it's like, to the best we can, what might be going on in a person's brain who is experiencing psychosis?
Yes. So these are difficult things to understand. I, frankly, bluntly, 30 years ago, thought I understood them better than I do today. I think I have gained a lot of knowledge and have a lot of understanding, and that humility and recognition of limitations is an important part of this. One of the analogies that clinical patients have used that has helped me understand their experience is a nightmare analogy. Sometimes patients who have been through a psychotic episode lasting a few days or lasting longer will say it is like a nightmare that you can't wake up from. Some of it is somewhat organized, as most people are familiar with a nightmare, where one part of the dream, the nightmare, moves logically, at least in some sense, to the next part, and to the next part, and to the next part. Some aspects of the nightmare dream are completely disconnected, the way dreams can sometimes be. So a person feels that they're in this one place, and then they're in this other place, and something happened. In a nightmare, there is anxiety, there is fear, there is overwhelming anxiety, sometimes so strong that even normal people, when we wake up from that bad dream, from that true nightmare, it takes us a few minutes to really recognize that we're awake and it was all a dream, and thank goodness none of it really happened. If you can imagine this going on for days and days and days, and all kinds of different things playing into it, and some things seeming very clear, and other things seeming very confused, and events seeming connected, but also at the same time disconnected, these are some of the descriptions that clinical patients have given me to help understand their experience of psychosis. And I think it's a very powerful way to think about it. Most people have had some personal experience with bad dreams. Most people have had some personal experience with something that you would really call a nightmare, that you wake up from and it's like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that didn't really happen.
I would like to talk a little bit about whether you saw in any of the evidence you reviewed, any indication that Mr. Jonchuck was under the influence of drugs, or alcohol for that matter, on the night of that Phoebe died?
It's certainly something that I looked for and was aware of as an issue. It's always going to be an issue in any case, clinical or forensic case, as a person using illicit drugs. I didn't see any indication that he was under the influence of either prescription or non-prescription drugs.
And was it as part of your process in any sort of insanity evaluation, is that something that you're going to look for and rule out as a possibility? Or?
Yes, it's a critical part of the assessment.
Okay. As part of the records that were provided to you, did you see the records that John had been at St. Joseph's Hospital on December 29th of 2014?
Yes.
And do you recall what he went in for and what happened?
Basically, my best recollection is he presented with complaints of worry about his heart and fear that he might be having a heart attack or having a heart problem.
And what was the response at the emergency room to that?
The emergency room assessment was that he was not suffering from a cardiac or heart condition, a heart attack or anything else, and their conclusion was that this was an anxiety episode.
In the course of your training to become a physician, Did you have an opportunity to do a rotation or an internship in an emergency room?
I did. I worked at the Tampa General Emergency Room for several months.
Okay. So do you have some familiarity with what happens in an emergency room when this type of situation would present itself?
I have a good deal of familiarity with it, both from that experience and subsequent hospital practice and experience.
Okay. In the records that you saw from December 29th of 2014, was there an indication that the hospital had done any sort of drug testing on Mr. Jonchuck?
No.
Is there anything that you, as an experienced physician, can conclude from the lack of any record of that?
Yes.
And what is that?
It's a high priority in an emergency room, particularly if somebody presents with irritability, agitation, anxiety, that kind of thing. And they don't hesitate to do drug testing. So the fact that there is no drug testing would be an indication that they didn't see indications of drug intoxication or drug influence.
Okay. And this was just a week or so before Phoebe died?
Yes.
Moving into another area, can brain illness and mental illness, such as Mr. Jonchuck has, can it be treated?
It certainly can be treated. I've tried for a very long time to devote myself to treating mental illness and brain illness. Brain illness of the type that we're talking about here today it cannot be cured. We cannot cure these conditions. There is no treatment which is curative. We can manage it. Some people can be, even with rather severe conditions, can be restored to normal functional lives. So we can treat it. We can't cure it. It tends to run a long-term course. Now, let me add that here's a place where it's really useful to make this distinction between what I've described as psychiatric brain illness and mental illness. So mental illness tends to be a more mild, more functional, more time-limited condition. And it is a condition which may be cured. That is, you have a problem, you get treatment, you get better, and it never comes back. And you don't even have to take medication to prevent it from coming back. So that would be a cure. Those things that are more rooted in the fundamental brain functioning, and that certainly includes psychosis, are not curable.
So can John's brain be fixed?
It cannot be fixed.
As a clinical physician, psychiatrist, are you familiar with reasons why a person who may need treatment from you may stop coming to you?
Yes.
And how do you refer to that, and what might that look like?
So there are two major areas there. One is the person is, for some reason, hostile or rejecting of treatment, sometimes because of the illness itself, sometimes because of social stigma or other issues. The other is that there are what we call barriers to treatment. And barriers to treatment today refer to those things outside of a patient's immediate control that make it difficult for them to get treatment. Most people in our present society and community who have chronic illness have encountered some barriers to treatment. A barrier to treatment is your doctor isn't practicing in the community anymore and you didn't get a notice about that, and you find one day you don't have a doctor anymore. A barrier to treatment is that you've lost your life, your medical insurance because you've gone to a different job. A barrier to treatment is that you need transportation and you can't get there. A barrier to treatment is something which is outside of your control that makes it difficult for you to go to your doctor and get treatment. John faced barriers to treatment that were related to his disruption of care with Dr. Arthur.
How so?
He lost his health insurance.
And was that at the end of the time that he was seeing Dr. Arthur in December of 13?
Yes.
When somebody experiences a barrier to treatment, maybe they don't have their insurance anymore, they can't get their medications, might a person turn to other means to try to alleviate the symptoms of their brain illness?
It is unfortunately very common for people to turn to alcohol, marijuana, and other more serious and more problematic drugs to deal with anxiety, sleep disorders, other mental disturbances and distress and illness, and not just psychiatric illness, but other illness. So unfortunately, one of the complications of barriers to treatment is that people seek ineffective and sometimes harmful medication, non-medication, and illicit drug alternatives. So yes, that happens, and it's a big problem in medicine and a big problem in psychiatry.
I want to talk specifically for a moment about the records that you reviewed from the Pinellas County Jail and the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center in Gainesville. Were those records important to you in developing your opinion in this case?
Yes, they are very important. The records from his incarceration are of some importance and value. The records of his treatment in the hospital are especially valuable because they include documentation from medical professionals in a clear, formal, objective professional setting of his behavior, his actions, his state of mind to the extent that that can be determined.
We've talked about Dr. Arthur a little bit. Did you have a chance to, well, not a chance, in reviewing the records from Dr. Arthur, did you see the different medications that John was prescribed by Dr. Arthur?
I did.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about a couple of those. What is Seroquel?
Seroquel is a very sedating antipsychotic medication. Its primary use is to treat psychosis. It's also used sometimes to sedate a person who is anxious and agitated and can't sleep. Typically it's used in hospital settings or in severe cases because it is a very powerful drug.
What about Abilify?
Abilify is also an antipsychotic medication. It is approved for use in treatment of depression in some treatment-resistant cases in addition. So it has some benefits both for psychosis and depression.
And Adderall?
Adderall is a stimulant medication used to treat attention deficit disorder and other attentional problems. It is an amphetamine. It is a dangerous prescription drug. It is important that it be used very carefully.
Okay. And finally, did you see in the notes that John had also been prescribed Ambien by Dr. Arthur?
Yes.
And what is the significance of that?
So Ambien is a sleep medication, a medication specifically used and designated to help people sleep. And the significance of that is that there is this connection between psychosis and sleep disorders where one makes the other worse and so on and so on. And the fact that he's prescribed Ambien means that the doctor was concerned that a sleep disorder was present there and medication to address that was necessary.
Have you had an opportunity to review the records as to the medications that John has been prescribed by the doctor at the hospital in Gainesville and here at Pinellas County Jail as well?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to talk about a couple of those. Is John on a couple of different types of Haldol?
He is on two different formulations of Haldol, one oral and one via a shot, an injection.
Okay. Why would a person need both?
Haldol is an antipsychotic medication. It's a powerful antipsychotic medication. It doesn't really have any other approved uses except as an antipsychotic medication. When a psychotic condition, both the baseline level and the tendency to have severe episodes, is especially difficult to treat from a physiological point of view, that is, the person's physiology, not their choices or their decisions, but their basic physical makeup, make it difficult for a medication to have the beneficial effect. Sometimes giving it to them with two different methods, a shot and oral medication, can have additional benefits. So the fact that they're giving it to them in both of these forms is an indication of the difficulty in getting these symptoms under control.
Did you also see from the records that John is currently prescribed the Seroquel?
Yes.
And as we just mentioned, that's an antipsychotic as well?
Yes, and to some extent it has the benefit that although it is very sedating, and that's a problem for patients, they go flat, they lose their facial expressions, they don't seem to respond emotionally when they're on Seroquel, but it does help them sleep.
What about Klonopin?
Klonopin is an anti-anxiety medication. It's a medication which is often used in combination with other medications. It is a somewhat less powerful medication than these other medications, but it's a medication that's used to reduce, especially daytime anxiety.
And Wellbutrin?
And Wellbutrin is an antidepressant medication, primary antidepressant medication used by a lot of people, commonly used for the treatment of depression. And it is compatible with these other medications that are being used. So it's a medication which may be less likely to cause medication interactions with these other powerful drugs that he's taking.
And gabapentin?
Gabapentin is a medication which is used for seizure disorders. It's used for depression. It's used for to stabilize mood. I'm hesitating because it is a medication which is sometimes used as a medication of last resort when you think that all of these things aren't quite working and you believe that maybe adding one more thing to stabilize a person's emotions might be helpful.
And what is Cogentin?
And Cogentin is a very specific medication used to treat muscle and neurological side effects of Haldol. Those conditions sometimes produce a condition of severe cramping to the point of distorted body positions that Haldol and Seroquel can both produce, and Cogentin blocks that side effect.
You mentioned that gabapentin can be used for seizures. Did you see a history in the records, Dr. Arthur and or others, that John has been being treated for seizures throughout his life?
Yes.
Could you describe for the jury a little bit about what a differential diagnosis is and the process of coming to a final diagnosis in a case?
Yes. So as I've been discussing, arriving at a diagnosis is a formal and definite but also complicated process. And to some extent, a diagnosis in any medical situation is a little bit of a moving target. It's also a process where a physician needs to have a very open mind about all the things that could be a problem. Sometimes what looks obvious on the surface is not the accurate diagnosis. So in medical procedure and medical training, we have a method or a process called a differential diagnosis. The idea of a differential diagnosis is to come up with a good long list of all the things that could possibly be the diagnosis or could possibly contribute to the diagnosis, and then little by little narrow it down to the smallest number, possibly just one, that seems to capture all of the information. So a differential diagnosis is the long list of all possible diagnoses that one would arrive at before getting to the short list of the most probable diagnoses.
Okay. And did you go through that process in this case?
I did.
And when we talked about ruling out the fact that this was caused by drugs on the night of the offense, is that part of the process?
Yes.
And are you aware that other experts in this case have come to opinions as to whether or not John suffers from a severe mental illness?
Yes.
For the experts that are testifying as to John's mental state at the time of the offense, do you know about Dr. Maples?
I do.
And do you agree with his opinion about the serious mental illness?
I do.
Dr. Otto?
Yes.
Dr. Burston?
That there is serious mental illness, yes.
And Dr. Williams and Dr. Hernandez, John's treating psychiatrists, do you agree with them that he has a serious mental illness?
I do. And let me just be very, very clear. I agree with all of those doctors that there's a serious mental illness. I think if you put us all in a room together and for 4 hours and discussed all the details, there would be a lot of little differences here and there. I think there are a lot of little differences. It's reasonable, even important, that different experts see a lot of little differences. The bottom line, and in the context of your question, that we would all characterize this as serious and severe mental illness, I think that all of those professionals are in agreement there.
Moving into a different topic, what is a personality disorder?
A personality disorder, in order to explain that, I need to briefly sort of take a step back from this case and this circumstance and describe how we approach mental illness and brain illness on the one hand and functional behavioral characteristics on the other hand. In that respect, it is central to medicine to try to identify what's an illness on the one hand and what is a variation of normal on the other hand, or some other condition which is not a mental illness or a medical illness, but is a condition that interferes with a person's well-being. So in all of medicine, there's this effort to distinguish disease from other things that are possibly a problem, but are not primary disease processes. Personality disorders are characterized as exaggerated personality characteristics which are dysfunctional, which interfere with a person functioning in their normal life and circumstances. So it's not the same as a brain illness. It's not, in my opinion, quite the same as a mental illness. It is more of a normal condition which is exaggerated and causes problems in the person's life. So one of the types of personality disorders is a dependent personality disorder. A person who has a dependent personality disorder depends on other people, looks to other people for help, blames other people for their problems in a way which is much more than most of us do that. So they have an exaggerated, relentless tendency to be dependent on others and attribute their problems to other people. They don't take responsibility for their own actions. They don't initiate things and make good choices for themselves. Now, if that person has an underlying illness that makes it essentially impossible for them to have a fully developed, responsible personality, we don't call that a personality disorder. We call that something else. So if a person has trisomy 21, Down's syndrome, they're very likely to have the characteristics of a dependent personality disorder, that they don't do things in a consistent, responsible way, that they have trouble taking care of themselves all the time. We don't call that a personality disorder. We call that trisomy 21, Down syndrome, and we understand that it has these characteristics. If, on the other hand, we have somebody who has none of these brain illnesses, no particular mental illness, they go to high school, they go to college, and they're always trying to depend on people. They can't do anything for themselves. They depend on their parents. They blame their employers when they get fired. They don't take responsibility for their own actions. That we might call a personality disorder, a dependent personality disorder in particular.
I don't think I've asked you yet about this book. You know what this book is?
I do.
All right. We've heard a lot about it in the last couple of weeks. Do you use this book?
I do.
For the record, I should say I'm referring to the DSM-5. You use this?
I do.
All right. Does this book talk to you about diagnosing somebody with the personality disorder versus a different mental illness, and how those two interact or don't interact?
Yes. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, current 5 version, is a source that I use and I respect. I don't agree with everything in it, but it talks about primary mental illness, and it talks about personality disorder. This formulation characterizes them as different in a way which is similar to, not identical to, what I have just described. And basically it says that if characteristics that might be related to a personality disorder are better explained by other more fundamental disease processes, then one shouldn't ascribe personality disorder or make the diagnosis of personality disorder, because those qualities, characteristics, deficits, symptoms, problems are better explained by understanding the fundamental underlying disease process.
So, do you diagnose John with a personality disorder?
I do not.
And why is that?
He has many of the characteristics of personality disorder, but he has brain illness and mental illness, and he has had those conditions since childhood, certainly since adolescence, possibly from the time of his birth. So those problems in his personality development, those problems that are related to personality disorder diagnosis, come from the underlying brain and mental illness. And therefore it's not appropriate to characterize it as personality disorder.
Do you think Mr. Jonchuck ever became in his life a really self-sufficient, stable adult?
No. I believe there are a few times that he seemed to function adequately for several months in a row, maybe even for 6 months in a row, but I do not believe he ever achieved a level of development and health and well-being where he was able to consistently function as a reliable, self-sufficient adult.
Are there things that you can attribute that to?
He had mental illness from childhood. Absolutely, certainly from adolescence. Very likely, although it's very difficult to get the information from earlier in childhood, possibly from birth, based on some information that his mother may have used drugs or alcohol during her pregnancy. So he grew up with these problems. They were not effectively identified and dealt with. He was raised by a family that didn't provide an optimal environment for a child, to put it in a very charitable way. This was not an environment that would have compensated for other problems that existed in his prenatal development or his childhood development. So we talk about risk factors and protective factors. A risk factor is that your mother drank alcohol during pregnancy. A protective factor is that you grew up in a good, stable home and went to good schools and your parents were both there and took care of you and you had health insurance. He had the risk factors, he didn't have the protective factors.
During the course of your evaluation with John, I'm going to move into sort of the heart of the opinion here. During the course of your evaluation with John, did you ask him what happened on the night that Phoebe died?
I did.
What did he tell you?
He told me that he was afraid he wouldn't be able to tell me exactly, that he had trouble remembering it. I was very careful at that part of the interview to say to him when I first asked him about that, I want you to try your best to tell me right now only those things that you're pretty sure you can remember from your own memory, and not things that you've learned after the fact, not things that people have told you, not things that you've put together that you think are probably true because it makes sense. But tell me first what you can remember from your own memory of what happened that night. He said he remembered the police, he remembered the bridge, he remembered Phoebe being in her car seat and undoing the car seat. He didn't say these things in an organized, systematic way as I'm describing them. In fact, as he began to describe these things, his sentence structure broke down. He spoke in fragments and phrases. He said things that were chronologically disconnected, so I had to ask him questions such as, wait a minute, can you tell me, did this happen before this, or did this happen after this? So as he was relating this to me, he became confused and somewhat disoriented. He told me he remembered dropping Phoebe off the bridge. He remembered feeling that this somehow would make her safe. He remembered being questioned by the police after the fact. I asked him about leaving the scene, driving away, being followed by the police, all the commotion that's described in the police reports before he's apprehended. He was not sure. He said, I know all about that, but I don't know how much I remember. He remembered trying to talk to the police afterwards. He remembered being afraid. He remembered the Bible, something about the Bible. And as he started to relate those memories to me, he shifted and began to tell me in present tense, present day, his continuing beliefs that that Swedish Bible has some special importance and power to his life. This is a manifestation of continuing psychosis.
So even in July of 2017, when you interviewed him, when he was at the state hospital on all the medications, that's still going on?
Yes. So one of Well, I think I've answered your question as far as it goes here.
Based on your evaluation, everything you reviewed, did you develop an opinion as to whether John was insane at the time that Phoebe died?
I did.
What is your opinion?
Given the standards in Florida and his condition, it is my opinion that he meets the criteria for insanity, and that is specifically that he was not aware in any reasonable, rational, even primitive way of the nature and consequence of his actions, nor was he aware of the wrongfulness of his actions.
Okay. Yana, may we approach for just a moment?
Yes.
Doctor, before we go into the more specifics about the events of the day and the bridge, I'd like to ask you about the statement that you were made aware of that John had reportedly said to a friend of his, Melody Dishman. Do you know what statement I'm talking about?
Yep.
About claiming insanity if he ever got in trouble?
Yes.
Okay. Did you attach any significance to that?
I did not attach significance to that, no.
Why is that?
People say all kinds of goofy things. People say lots of things about being crazy, being insane, what they might do in some other circumstance. If I win the lottery, I'm going to fill in the blank. It's just not reasonable to put a lot of weight on those kinds of statements that are made in a completely different context than one might be applying them to and attribute significance to them.
And had you developed in your opinion that there was little, if any, significance to that statement even before you knew it had allegedly been made when Mr. Jonchuck was 12 years old?
Excuse me, Deputy Johnson. Can we put this Kleenex? No problem. You can keep the box.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to go back to that question. Had you developed your opinion that this statement that John is purported to have made, that you attached little, if any, significance to it, had you made that determination even before you knew that it had been made when he was 12 years old?
Yes. My initial understanding and conclusion of the statement was that it was made in a remote context. I didn't have information about how remote that context was. Certainly, my actual assumption when I first considered it is that he had made it sometime as an adult. And when I learned that he had made it at 12, I would attribute even less significance to it.
So I'd like to talk specifically about the symptoms of John's brain illness that affect his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions, or the wrongfulness of his actions, on the night of the offense, okay?
Yes?
On that night, did John have a rational understanding of life and death?
He did not. His understanding of the basics of life and death were distorted by his delusions, by hallucinations, by belief that demons and the devil were connected to him, by a sense of a belief that somehow the whole fate of the world might depend on his life or death, on Phoebe's life or death. He was filled with fear and anxiety and dread that some terrible, speakable and unspeakable, by which I mean definable and undefinable thing, might happen that was out of his control. So all of those basics about what common sense reality tells us about life and death were not accessible in his head, in his thinking processes.
And if you don't have a rational understanding of the difference between life and death, can you appreciate the wrongfulness of your actions?
I would say, generally speaking, no. I don't know that I would want to apply that to every single case without looking at the details, but generally, no.
In the specifics of this case?
Certainly.
Okay. And if you don't have a rational understanding of the difference between life and death, can you logically understand the nature and consequences of your actions?
No.
How did the hallucinations or hearing voices aspect of John's psychotic state play into what happened that night?
It's my conclusion that John was suffering from, on that night, he was suffering from hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder, and the emotional aspect of psychosis that I've described. So hallucinations are this false information coming to a person in a way that, on the one hand, they understand everybody else isn't hearing this voice, but they still have the feeling and the belief that this voice is real, it's powerful, it's authoritative, and sometimes, and this is an element of his experience, it has the quality that one feels they must act on it. They have to pay attention to it, and they better do something about it. So the hallucinations that he was experiencing, they were confusing, they were distorted, they were not explicit in many details, but they were pushing him in the direction of doing something definitive based on irrational false information.
And what sort of specific hallucinations was he having as it related to Phoebe or himself?
The ones that I would consider most significant were the ones that were related to his belief that demons and evil was present and engaged and affecting him and Phoebe and the world.
And as he's experiencing that, is that seeming, in your opinion, seeming real to him?
Yes.
And
I would even add, in a way, even a little more than real, because when a person is psychotic and they have these experiences, they're not able to ask themselves the way a normal person might, is this real? Their ability to ask the question, is this real information? Does this make sense? Somebody, as an example, somebody comes to your door, a salesman, and they offer you the best deal in the world, and it's too good to be true, and you're going to be able to retire next week. A normal person can say, that's not real. I don't believe that. When you're psychotic and you're getting this false information, you don't have that ability to ask the question in a reasonable way, is this real? That's one of the things that's lost when you're psychotic.
And as a result of that, might a person act on that hallucination?
Yes.
And did you see that happening in this case?
Yes.
In what way?
I think the tragedy of him dropping Phoebe over the bridge is the horrific example of that. I think he got in his car that night for psychotic reasons or psychotic motivations in a psychotic state. I think he was running away from something that he didn't even know he was running away from. It wasn't a rational choice.
What you just mentioned, the ultimate tragedy that Phoebe died, how does that, as John, as her father, being the one who did that, how does that impact all of this analysis as to his state of mind and how we're doing after the fact? And leave that.
It is my conclusion that, as a part of my assessment of him, that he loved Phoebe. Was he a good father all the time? No. Was he a perfect father? Certainly not. There's no such thing. Did he make some mistakes and did he do some bad things before this happened? Yes. My understanding of the circumstance, my review of all the information, strongly indicates to me that he cared for his daughter and that he loved his daughter. And that means he will grieve the loss of his daughter. Whether he's responsible or not, regardless of whether he can forgive himself or not, he is a parent who is grieving the loss of a loved child. On top of his brain illness and his pre-existing mental illness, he is suffering from this grief and the guilt.
Jack, just to approach.